Every day, there are hundreds of families who are mourning and grieving because of the failure of this country, of our politicians, of our medical and scientific advisors to get this right. I am ashamed. I'm ashamed at the medical collusion with what has happened. Speaking truth to power is supposed to be a core skill of public health people. I am ashamed of some of my colleagues. I just hope that some of them will wake up and realize, late as it is, that they can't keep doing this. From the outset, we've been told we're following the science, we're doing things in the right time, in the right way, as and when it needs to happen. And here we are, heading to be the worst affected country, certainly in Europe. And we've been following the science. What is it that the other countries have been following that they are doing so much better than we are in most cases? You know, and it seems that we ignore the science when it doesn't suit us, or we jump to conclusions, for example, on the mask issue. The science would tell us that frontline workers should be fully protected with personal protection equipment. If we're following the science, why are we sending frontline workers in to do their jobs, not being protected? There have now been over 100 deaths of health workers, over 100 deaths of health workers, and the government struggles to tell us how many there are, where they are, and who they are. I am ashamed, and I'm sure the rest of us who are so dependent on our medical and nursing and other healthcare and social care colleagues are ashamed that our government is letting them down in this way. I think the Sunday Times Insight piece this weekend was a major marker in this whole saga. I mean, this has now been going on for 2.5 months in the UK. And this piece by the Insight team went into the detail, it brought out the facts. And of course, it was gratifying for me that it really was supporting many of the things that I've been saying over this last, 10 weeks. At the heart of it is this failure of the Prime Minister to convene and chair and get a grip of COBRA at the beginning of February when he needed to. And the fact that he'd actually missed 5 COBRAs, 5, I thought it was only 2, but it was 5, is such an indictment. But all the other things are in there about the failure to keep up to date with the emergency planning, the failure to maintain stocks, the failure to order supplies when it became clear what was going on. The general attitude, the laid back, laissez-faire attitude, the lack of transparency and openness, the approach to those press conferences where questions never get answered and all the public is offered is waffle. It was all in there. And then within a matter of hours, you had this response from government, a really badly written response. I mean, I don't know who has written it. We can only imagine whose hand was on that pen, but it doesn't feel as though it's been written by a properly trained civil servant who would normally do such a thing and do a rebuttal. And it really has all the feel about it of the press conferences themselves. It's a lot of flannel, a lot of just vague denial and assertion. I think that there's a sense of panic about it. You can get the feel for that, the way it's been rushed out within a matter of hours. The contrast between how that's been rushed out when it's so difficult to get an answer on anything else. It's so strange. I mean, it feels very angry. It doesn't feel measured, as though it's just set about just trying to cloud the situation, muddy the waters, and distract attention from the central evidence that the Sunday Times team have put together about the failures to be prepared and the failure to act, and the failure of the Prime Minister to take responsibility and to get a grip. So I think we're in a different place now. You know, in a sense, the mirror has been held up to government. They can continue to keep bluffing, and the advisors can continue to go along with this charade, or they can start coming clean and putting their hands up and admitting the mistakes that they've made, so that we can avoid further mistakes, because there's still plenty of scope for mistakes to be made. The only way to get this right is to admit when you're wrong. And that's what the government needs to do now. And what we need to do is create a shared approach to going forward together in this next phase of this terrible epidemic. One of the shocking things about yesterday was the way in which a number of the other mainstream commentators and journalists seemed to have been taken by surprise by the Sunday Times article. And I think we've had the growing sense of seeing and listening to them at those press conferences that they're becoming absorbed into a kind of groupthink where they've become part of this collusion with government about what the narrative is and what the narrative should be, on the verge of it being frank propaganda. We are late in the day, but we must rescue this country from propaganda. We must shine the light on this. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. We need sunlight on this story to save many more lives. We need to stop and reflect at this moment about some of the rhetoric which we've been subjected to over the past 2 or 3 months, going right back to the Prime Minister's press conference when he was talking about this country being Superman. You know, we've had 3 years of rhetoric about Brexit, claims of all kinds, and the point has been reached where, well, it's quite common for politicians to believe their own rhetoric, but this has reached a new level. The notion that somehow this country is so exceptional that the virus will just have a look at us and go away. We don't have to use tried and tested public health measures, you know, in this case, identifying where the virus is by testing, by contact tracing, by triaging people, whether or not they've got the virus, whether or not they're ill, isolating, quarantining, and treating. These are classic public health measures. We decided not to go ahead with them. We threw our hands up on the 12th of March, whenever it was, and stopped doing it. And we've seen what's happened. Every day, there are hundreds of families who are mourning and grieving because of the failure of this country, of our politicians, of our medical and scientific advisors to get this right. I am ashamed. I'm ashamed at the medical collusion with what has happened. Speaking truth to power is supposed to be a core skill of public health people. I am ashamed of some of my colleagues. I just hope that some of them will wake up and realize, late as it is, that they can't keep doing this. When I hear the medical opinions expressed at these press conferences, I am totally confused. I do not understand where they're coming from. Nobody can claim either that we were successful in our approach at the beginning or in the middle and since. We have not been successful. We tried to contain, we didn't contain. There's a suggestion that the curve might be flattening, but we've let out of the bag a whole herd of cats into care homes. We've allowed our people to go unprotected into the clinical environment. Nobody can claim this as a success. This is, if you will, it's on a par with Dunkirk. That's the sort of metaphor that comes to mind. A failure of the largest order that's put the population at risk. We don't know what's going on in the care homes, except that we know that there are many deaths every day. In my own city of Liverpool, there's a care home in Wavertree that's now had 16 deaths in it. There was one in Durham on Friday that had 13. It looks as though something over half of the care homes in the country now have cases. Estimates I've seen are suggesting that between 5,000 and 10,000 people in care homes have died from corona. They are not included in the statistics. On the prison estate, we've gone from having double figures, 13 or 15 or something like that, cases in prisoners and prison officers a couple of weeks ago to about 400 now. 13 deaths is the figure I've seen. Doubling of cases in prisons every 2 or 3 or 4 days. If it continues at that rate, we will have thousands of cases in prison and at least hundreds of deaths within the next few weeks. And let's not forget that prison officers and care assistants don't live in the settings where they are normally. They go back to their own families. So when we have this narrative that comes out of these press conferences that seems to claim that the epidemic is all but over, or it's on the decline, or it's leveled, when it's taking a view looking really at the hospitals, and it's not looking at these other epidemics that are going on in care homes, in prisons, and among other groups in the community, then we are being led down the garden path. We need to make sure that all those people in those at-risk settings are being provided with safety, with the necessary personal protective equipment where that's needed, where there is routine testing going on, where the testing can lead to triaging, leading to isolating, leading to quarantining. It's back to those basic time-tested public health measures. When this is over, there's going to need to be a fundamental review of public health in this country because it is now in such a dire state. The government goes out of its way to avoid taking responsibility for any measure. It fields the scientists when it suits them. It's outsourced the decision taking to the hospitals, to the schools, to the supermarkets, to the public, saying it's public pressure that led to the lockdown. And really, it's been an abdication of leadership because in an emergency, government needs to lead. It needs to take the public with it by open argument and discussion, not by stage-managed press conferences, presumably run by the same people who ran the government's election campaign last winter, where questions are tightly managed, and even though they've been tightly managed, are never answered. And then we're told that the government is responding to the public, you know, pull the other one. I'm told that Michael Gove used these words about running it hot, and I'm totally taken aback if this man who aspires to the leadership of the government, I mean, he aspires to the leadership of the government still, you can see it written in his face, that he would use words like that. He would let the public down in that way. Urge the government to run this hot, whatever this means. It sounds as though it means let the virus run free. It sounds as though it's going back to this notion of herd immunity. Let the thing out, let's see what happens, and so on. Totally irresponsible. We've already had, we're now heading towards 20,000 hospital deaths, probably 30,000 deaths in total with the care home and community deaths, and we're told, let it run hot. This is unbelievable. This is the United Kingdom. This is the bastion of democracy, the bastion of parliament, the bastion of human rights, not protecting its own citizens. I'm afraid, we are in a crisis here, and we need to get to grips with this because there are weeks and months ahead of us here, and how we go forward will determine how many more unnecessary lives are lost. There's pressure on government to let the children back at school. There's been talk over the weekend about primary schools. I don't believe there should be any letting up of the lockdown until we have large-scale testing in place so that we can monitor exactly what the situation is now and what happens after we take each step towards easing off. So I don't think we should be doing anything now, at least until the end of May, because I don't see us having large-scale testing in place before then. We're told that there's a target of 100,000 tests a day by the end of April, which is now 10 days away. I think we're about a third of the way to that. Mr. Gove on television on Sophie Ridge's program yesterday was challenged about whether this is to be 100,000 tests actually done or whether it's the capacity, and he didn't answer that question. We probably are going to need 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 tests done every day before we can get the country back to something like normality. That means we're going to have to train up an enormous number of people to be doing the testing, both in the community and in the laboratories, to support the existing capacity that we've got. The issue about PPE is a continuing scandal. You've now seen doctors and nurses and health and social workers organising protests around the country about them being put in harm's way by the failure of the government to deliver on this. We've heard today that Barber, of all people, have now started to deliver some garments. You might ask, where are all the other people? Where are the textile manufacturers? Where are our entrepreneurs? People who are in import and export, people who've now bought some of the old mills in Lancashire. Where are they? Has anyone invited them to produce gowns and scrub equipment? Or is it just the brand names familiar to members of parliament and the government, like Barber, for goodness sake? This is more known to the hunting and shooting fraternity, really. And one wonders, what about that armada of small ships that saved us from Dunkirk, and which we've seen all the folk around the country in church halls and in small-scale factories, small and medium-sized enterprises, what the Americans call mom-and-pop businesses, people getting their sewing machines out and beginning to kit out. Where are they in the government's planning? Why on earth didn't they ask for that help earlier on? As the Sunday Times Insight article yesterday really confronted the situation, it was said on the Andrew Marr programme that hindsight is a wonderful thing. Well, I'm telling you something. I'm not having hindsight. I had foresight. From the very first interview I gave on Sky News in January, from the interview I gave on February the 1st outside Arrow Park Hospital on the Wirral, I've been saying what was wrong and what needed to be done, and I wasn't alone. There were many voices saying the same things, and they were ignored, they were ridiculed, we were closed down, prevented from speaking, and patronised indeed when I was on the Question Time programme on BBC, patronised by members of the panel. And, you know, that's the reality. The evidence is all there, it's all documented, and I've been documenting it. I've been keeping a diary, and it'll all be there when the inquiry is held. Over the last few days, there's been attempts to really do a lot of finger pointing at both China and the World Health Organization. And we've also had this hubble bubble around ending the lockdown. And it's caused a lot of background noise, which makes it difficult to think clearly about what we should be doing over the next 3, 6, 9 months, because that's the timescale that we need to plan for. And also about how we need to support those people who are finding this so hard, not least from a mental health point of view. I think later on, in the cool light of day, there will be criticism of China. There will be criticism of China. China was late to report, and what they said at the time, you know, was probably not accurate. They probably played things down, and we need to have that story out. Since WHO got involved with China, the data from China seems to have been much more reliable and much more helpful. From really sometime in February, that got to be much better. And they've also been really good about sharing their clinical experience with colleagues, with doctors and clinicians around the world. And that'll be part of the story as well. WHO, yes, I think there will be criticism, valid criticism of WHO. But, you know, WHO finds itself in these situations between a rock and a hard place. They were criticized over swine flu for declaring a global pandemic, when in the end, there were far less deaths than people had thought. Then they were criticized over Ebola for not declaring a pandemic soon enough. And then we've had the same thing here. I was among those who was saying in February, it's time to declare a pandemic. And actually it was a couple of weeks before WHO finally got round to it. So yes, there will be criticism of that. But let's not fall in with that and collude with turning the spotlight away from where we are still getting it wrong and where we need to get it right to save thousands of lives. That should be our focus now. There's time to look at the other things later on. Our priority now must be to get it right to save lives in this country. I'm reluctant to get engaged with the nitty-gritty of the politics of this at the moment. We clearly need stronger, better leadership. Hopefully, once Parliament starts meeting again in the next few days, we'll begin to get some constructive interaction between the political parties in the House of Commons, or virtually, however they go about doing it. But I think there must be questions as well over the nature of the advice, the professional advice that the government has been getting, how it's been getting it, how it's being received, how it's being handled. And we need much greater transparency over this. For example, we need to know the names of the people on the SAGE committee. We need to know who these folk are and what their value systems are and what inputs they're making, because we can't afford not to have the benefit of all the points of view from all parts of the country, from women as well as men, and from many different disciplines, rather than from a narrow sect-like group of people who seem to be drawn on so far. I think that parliamentarians of all stripes have given the government the benefit of the doubt for too long. This is not a party political point I'm making. It's a point about Parliament and about the responsibilities of all members of Parliament to provide constructive criticism of how this is being handled. I don't think we need a general election. I don't think we necessarily need a change of party. What we need is some kind of joint approach across the House of Commons and the House of Lords to dealing with this situation in partnership with the public and the business community at large. I'm sitting here on a beautiful spring day. We've got daffodils from the garden on the table. There are rabbits here now. You know, the birds are nesting outside. This was my father's favorite month. It was actually the month in which he died quite a long time ago. But for me, April has always been a month of promise. We need to look forward to getting through this together and building a better world for our children, our grandchildren at the end of this. That's what we need to hang on to now in these dark days. But I believe we can do that. So thanks again for watching. Don't forget to leave your comments, register a like and share the clips, and register for Double Down News on Patreon, the 21st century news media.